Hello, everybody. We're going to start up now with panel 3. So if everyone can take a seat, we'll get started. And the good news is, after this panel, it's time for lunch. So thank you for your stamina. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld, once again. Can you hear me? Mic cut out? All right, I'll speak. This is a work in progress, so we are going to be improvising with various mic options depending on who's speaking. Once again, I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld. I'm the president here at the center. It's thrilling to have everybody here. It's great to have all you here in the building. And we want to turn now to the question of a pivotal moment in time. That, of course, is the fateful year 1948. It's a pivotal year, certainly in the history of Zionism. It's what some historians would call a point of divergence, by which we mean a point in time when the course of history could have gone any number of ways, but of course it ended up producing the reality that we know today. In that spirit of focusing on a specific year, what I hope our panelists can help shed some light on are the surprising, unknown, or potentially forgotten aspects of this particular year that will help us restore a sense of contingency to the moment, and to force us perhaps to rethink whether everything as it did unfold had to unfold that way, or whether there were possibilities that were never realized. But this is a moment of great change, and it's a time for us to be able to introduce 3 panelists who are extremely well qualified to comment on this particular fateful year. Jeffrey Herf, to my left, is Emeritus Distinguished Professor in the Department of History at the University of Maryland in College Park. His works include The Jewish Enemy from 2006, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World from 2009, and most recently, Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition for Establishing the Jewish State, published just last year. He also, by the way, has a new book forthcoming called 3 Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist, that is coming out with Routledge. Omer Bartov, to his left, is the Samuel Pizar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at my alma mater, Brown University. His books include Hitler's Army from 1991, Germany's War on the Holocaust, 2003, Anatomy of a Genocide, 2018, and Tales from the Borderlands, just last year, 2022. His new book, Genocide, the Holocaust in Israel-Palestine, will be forthcoming later this year in August. Deborah Dash-Moore, at the far left, is Frederick G.L. Hutwell, Professor of History and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She is an historian of American Jews and specializes in 20th century urban history. Her forthcoming book, Walkers in the City, Jewish Street Photographers of Mid-Century New York, extends her interest in urban Jewish history to photography, and she currently serves as editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. So let's get started with Jeffrey Herf. And Jeff, if I can prompt you to deliver some remarks on your recent book. You published this just last year, and part of your argument contains a lot of surprising things about the relationship between the United States and Israel, things that probably many of us have forgotten. Can you outline some of your argument for us?
I'll do my best. Gav, thank you very much. The Center for Jewish History is blessed with its new president, and you've done a wonderful job in bringing us all together. Thank you very much. This is the front cover of Israel's Moment, which was published by Cambridge University Press a year ago. The paperback came out last month. The political contours of the debates about Zionism before and not after statehood were in important respects the reverse of what has become a conventional wisdom since the 1970s, first in world politics and then in the intellectual and academic world. I'm going to describe those contours in the next 10 minutes. In 1945 and 46, Stephen Wise, Alba Silver, and Benjamin Axon of the American Zionist Emergency Council sent the United States State Department remarkably detailed and, in their essence, accurate accounts of the collaboration with Nazi Germany by Haj Amin al-Husseini, also known as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. They, as well as Brooklyn's Congressman Emanuel Seller, and liberal journalists, including I.F. Stone at the leftist daily PM, Frida Kirchway, editor of the left liberal flagship The Nation, and Alexander Uhl at the then left liberal New York Post, urged the United States to indict Husseini for war crimes in the upcoming Nuremberg war crimes trial. They urged the French government to extradite him to Allied custody. He was in French custody from May of 45 to May of 46. They failed. In May 1946, faced with the Allies' refusal to put, quote, the Mufti on trial, Stone wrote in The Nation that the rich annals of appeasement contain no more striking story than that of Haj Amin al-Husseini, no more convincing testimony to the readiness of the British government to be gulled. The following spring, Husseini's associates in the Arab Higher Committee sought and won the right to represent the Palestine Arabs at the United Nations in New York. In May 1947, Kirchway made the case in the pages of The Nation against according them that privilege. She wrote that the Arab Higher Committee is an almost exact equivalent in Middle Eastern terms of the cabal that ruled Hitler's Germany. In March 1948, Victor Bernstein, also at The Nation, wrote, one day the historian with access to the State Department records will link the wartime appeasement of the Arabs with the policy which is now unfolding. He was right. These liberal and leftist commentators argued that the Zionist project was the logical culmination of wartime anti-fascism, while on the other hand, anti-Zionism of the leadership around Husseini in the Arab Higher Committee was a logical culmination of the ideological affinities to Nazism that first emerged in the late 30s, persisted in their consequential wartime collaboration during the war and the Holocaust. The appeasement to which Bernstein referred was the policy of the State Department to curry favor with Arab states in hope of retaining access to Arab oil and to push back what they regard as the Zionist boon to Soviet presence in the Middle East. These issues raise the issue of Arab racism, which has not figured prominently enough over the decades in discussions of these issues. The international debate about Zionism before statehood took place most importantly in the newly established United Nations. The records of the UN Security Council and General Assembly, most now available via the online UN official document system, confirm that from May of 47 to May 49, the most emphatic and consequential support for the Zionist project did not come from the United States, from the representatives of the United States, but from the representatives of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. For example, on May 12, 1947, Alfred Fiedorkiewicz, Poland's representative to the United Nations, the vice president of the General Assembly, after the war, the mayor of Krakow, and a leader in the memorial activities regarding Auschwitz-Birkenau, Fiedorkiewicz delivered the most detailed account of the Holocaust to be voiced for many years at the United Nations. He did not have much competition. He spoke of another bond, a most tragic bond, which has been formed between my nation, that's the Poles, and the Jews. The bond was created by the Nazis. He informed his colleagues that he, the vice president of the General Assembly of the United Nations, was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and that he personally had seen 1.5 million Jews, not just victims of fascism, but Jews murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. 3 days later, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet representative to the United Nations, and later the very long-serving and famous Soviet foreign minister, stunned the United Nations by announcing support for a Jewish as well as an Arab state in a former British Mandate Palestine. The link between wartime anti-fascism and support for the Zionist project was apparent when Gromyko said, "The fact that no Western European state has been able to ensure the defense of the elementary rights of the Jewish people and to safeguard it against the violence of the fascist executioners explains the aspiration of the Jews to establish their own state." Throughout the decisive months of 47 and 48, before and during Israel's war for independence, the Soviet bloc diplomats battled American and British proposals to restrain Jewish and then Israeli advances on the battlefield, and in summer 1948, to separate the Negev desert from the new state. The records of the debates of spring and summer 48 in the UN Security Council are particularly important because they document the fundamental agreement of the Soviet and Ukrainian representatives Vasyl Tarasenko, later chair of the Department of History at Shevchenko University in Kyiv. On the one hand, the agreement of Gromyko and Tarasenko with Israeli diplomats, Moshe Sharett and Avi Ivan. And those agreements nurtured views in the British Foreign Office and in the United States National Security Establishment, the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon, that the Zionist project, though not inspired by the Soviet Union, was objectively serving to expand communist influence in the Middle East. This connection between Jews and communism that became so famous during World War II resurfaced after the war in the association of Zionism and the Soviet Union in the British Foreign Office and in the State Department. The emphatic and consequential opposition of the Zionist project by the Anglo-American national security establishment is another finding that emerges from examination of the files of the British and American governments that Victor Bernstein was hoping for. The State Department was then led by Secretary of State George Marshall, after President Truman, the most famous person in American public life, former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II. The Deputy Secretary, Robert Lovett, the Director of the Department's Near East Division, Loy Henderson, and the Marshall appointee, one George Kennan, the first director of the Policy Planning Staff, famous by then for being the author of the X telegram from Moscow, which inaugurated or created an intellectual rationale for the containment of communism in the Soviet Union. And these officials consistently tried to block the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And so did the Pentagon, the CIA, and the British Foreign Office, led by Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin. In response to the growing public support for the Zionist project in public opinion and politics, and Professor Moore will have some comments about the Exodus affair, which was so important in the emotions of public opinion that summer, an Anglo-American diplomatic counteroffensive emerged, and its key themes emerged in inter-office memos in summer and fall of '47. American and British officials argued that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine would be a disaster for American and Western national security interests because it would undermine Arab access to Arab oil, offer the Soviet Union an entry into the Middle East, and erode Britain's position in the region. In September of '47, as you see on the screen, Secretary Marshall summarized American policy in a note to Lewis Douglas, the British ambassador to the United States. Quote, "The fundamental cornerstone of our thinking, the United States, is the maintenance of Britain's position to the greatest possible extent. The U.S. counts heavily upon continued close British-American cooperation in the Middle East. Continued British military and political presence, in Marshall's view, was crucial for the recently announced policy of the containment of the Soviet Union and communism, yet the Zionists were in direct conflict with the British in Palestine." The anti-Zionist consensus that emerged in the State Department in the fall of '47 did so at the exact same time that President Truman supported the United Nations partition resolution that called for the establishment of two states in November 29, 1947. It was Kennan who articulated that consensus and enveloped it in the logic of the policy of containment of communism and the economic recovery of Western Europe, known in Washington as the Marshall Plan. He did so in several memos of January '48. He wrote that our vital interests in those areas will continue to be adversely affected to the extent that we continued to support partition. American support for the partition plan, he said, would provide a basis for anti-Jewish agitation in other parts of the world. And as this conference is about Zionism and American Jews, I think Kennan's comment is an important one to reflect on regarding the mood of the United States, of a very civilized and a very prominent figure of the American foreign policy establishment, one of the most famous figures in American diplomacy of the 20th century. He wrote, "The process of assimilation or integration of the individual Jew in the life of the country of which he is a citizen, which has been strongly advocated by what he called world Jewry in the past, would be made more difficult and he would be singled out for attack as an alien political factor. In the U.S., the position of the Jews would be gravely undermined as it became as it becomes evident to the public that in supporting a Jewish state in Palestine, we were in fact supporting the extreme objective of political Zionism to the detriment of overall U.S. security interests. Did you want to ask a question? Kennan's memos were crucial for solidifying the anti-Zionist consensus in this country, in our national security establishment, for two reasons. First, he was appointed by Marshall, and his views were assumed to be those of the Secretary of State. And second, by January 48, Kennan was famous as the author of the Doctrine of Containment in the then very young months of the Cold War. He offered an intellectual rationale for practical opposition to the Zionists, and that took the form of an unsuccessful effort by the State Department to cancel the partition resolution. Truman was furious, but also successful efforts to refuse to send Husseini to the war crimes trial he certainly deserved, and which I think would have been of enormous importance, impose an arms embargo in fall of 47 that persisted through the entirety of the war, and offer peace proposals in spring and summer 48 that undermined boundaries that were the result of Israeli military victories, and even sought to separate the Negev desert from the new state. Emanuel Seller, the Democratic congressman from Brooklyn, depending on your point of view, my point of view, one of the heroes of the establishment of the Jewish state and the Zionist project. He was the spark plug in the House of Representatives who organized his colleagues decades and decades before email made it so easy to send joint letters to the President, to the Secretary of State. He wrote to the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, in December of 47 on the arms embargo, that the United States should not impose an embargo on arms to the Jews. The embargo on arms to the Middle East may seem equitable at first glance, he wrote to Forrestal, but I do believe that if its end result will be that of sufficient arming of the Arabs, who already have states, and none for the Jews, such an embargo would be most reprehensible, unquote. The files of the State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA include extensive material on efforts to prevent both weapons and Jewish men of military age from reaching Palestine from Europe before May 14, 1948. The reports by American and diplomats in Europe link Jewish immigration from Europe to Palestine and then Israel with Soviet efforts to send agents to in the refugee stream. As I said, the famous link between Jews and communists resurfaced in these reports as suspicion of links between the Zionist project and Soviet influence. The Jewish agency and then Israel needed those weapons in those months, and as most of you know, the most important external source of weapons for the Jews and then Israel came from communist Czechoslovakia, and not from any of the Western democracies. In conclusion, on May 29th of 1949, after the General Assembly voted to offer membership to Israel, President Truman agreed to send a letter to Israeli then Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. Drafted by the State Department, it asserted, quote, given the American generous support to the creation of Israel, unquote, Israel should consider American criticisms of its current policy on territorial issues and refugees, criticisms that the State Department wrote could foster a reassessment of U.S. policy towards Israel. James McDonald, who had been appointed by Truman as the first U.S. ambassador to the State of Israel, and himself sympathetic to the Zionist project, had the unfortunate task of presenting this memo to David Ben-Gurion and then Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett. In his notes in the Foreign Relations of the United States volumes that are online, McDonald summarized David Ben-Gurion's objections to the American pressure as follows. The Prime Minister was unable to recall any strong action by the United States or the United Nations to enforce the November 29, 1947 partition resolution, or to prevent aggression by Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq in May of 1948. Instead, the arms embargo encouraged, this is Ben-Gurion, the Arab aggressors against Israel whose very existence was in danger. And then Ben-Gurion said to James McDonald, Had the Jews waited on the United States or the United Nations in 1948, they would have been exterminated. Israel's moment was that brief period when the passions of anti-fascism and the memory of the Holocaust in Harry Truman's White House had not yet been entirely displaced or modified by the very new moods of the then young Cold War. Part of the greatness of David Ben-Gurion as one of the leading, in my view, political leaders of the 20th century was to have seized that very brief and soon closed moment. By the middle of '49, the moment had definitely passed. During the anti-cosmopolitan purges of the early 50s, Stalin reversed course, spread the myth that Israel was a product of American imperialism, repressed the memory of Soviet support for the Zionist project, and launched a 4-decade campaign of vilification against Zionism in Israel. I view that campaign as one of the Soviet Union's most successful propaganda campaigns of the Cold War. With full access to relevant files, it's now possible to depict the realities of support and opposition to the Zionist project in those crucial years of Israel's moment and challenge myths let me leave it there. And challenge myths about those years that entered into world politics. And then, unfortunately, into the intellectual, journalistic, and academic discussion of Zionism and statehood in recent decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Omar Bartov, our next speaker, is going to be discussing 1948 from a different perspective. That is, by focusing on Israel's Declaration of Independence and addressing some of the tensions built into the document that may explain some of the problems that the country and American Jews as well continue to wrestle with today.
Thank you, and thank you again for this invitation, for organizing this event, and I'm very happy to be here. Before I begin my comments, I just want to make 2 very quick comments about some comments that were made in the first panel. The first is on the issue of modesty, and the second is on ethno-nationalism. I think that if you were to listen to the discussion of the modesty of Israeli policy and you were a Palestinian, you would be somewhat surprised. One would probably more likely speak about euphoria, and particularly euphoria of power. The second has to do with Einat Wilf's comment on ethno-nationalism. If we think about the outcome of World War I and the replacement of multinational empires by ethno-national or nation states, what we see is the creation of minorities, the actual phenomenon of a national minority. Many of these minorities were Jews. And that was one of the core reasons for anti-Jewish violence, particularly in Eastern Europe, where these nations are created. That kind of logic, which feeds into violence against Jews also during the Holocaust, is also the logic that is applied by the emergent state of Israel as it transforms the Palestinian majority that still exists there at the beginning of the war of 1948 into a minority. And it is the logic of nation states. So we may accept it, like it, but at least we have to say what it is. Now to my specific comments. Now in Zionist historiography, the year 1948 appears as the culmination of the long Jewish quest for rights and justice, which reached its climax in the immediate aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. Now, as some of you know, I recently completed a book on a long project on the transformation of an East European community of ethnic and religious coexistence into a community of genocide. And as I was completing this research, I came to reconsider this cardinal year of 1948 from a somewhat different perspective. This perspective, by now, over the last few months, has been strongly reflected in events that are occurring in Israel at this very moment, where I would say 2 crucial developments can be identified. The first is that the 56-year-long occupation of millions of Palestinians has now shifted to within the Green Line. What is occurring at the moment is an attempt to occupy the Jewish state itself. In other words, the occupation is now occupying Israel. This is what Hannah Arendt called the boomerang effect, and Aimé Césaire titled Un choc, un retour. Second, the realization has become increasingly prominent that we must reconsider the consequences of 1948 from two related perspectives. A, that the land can no longer be partitioned, and B, that the Declaration of Independence must become a draft constitution relevant to the entire population under Israeli control from the sea to the river. This has been a very long process, and the current crisis, triggered by the fact that Israel is being led by a prime minister indicted for criminal corruption, has been long in the making. At the core of this process is a gradual return to a new understanding of the meaning of 1948, the related events of the establishment of the Jewish state and the expulsion of the Palestinians. Here it is important to examine the principles articulated in the Israeli Declaration of Independence of May 14th, 1948, which is here, yeah, it's up here, which announced the creation of, quote, a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, which is the state of Israel. This state, it declared, would, quote, be open to Jewish immigration and the gathering of the diasporas. It would also strive to develop the land for all its inhabitants, its residents, would be based on the principles of liberty, justice, and peace, as was envisioned by the prophets of Israel. I should say not all prophets, but and would maintain complete social and political equality for all its citizens without any religious, racial, or gender distinction. It would ensure freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture, and would protect the holy sites of all religions. However, the declaration made specific mention of the Palestinians only in a different, separate paragraph, which depicted the local population as hostile to this endeavor, and yet magnanimously promised to tolerate its existence nonetheless, declaring, quote, we call, even in the midst of the bloody attacks conducted against us for months upon the sons of the Arab people who are residents of the state of Israel, to keep the peace and to take part in the building of the state, it's the Jewish state, of course, on the basis of full citizenship and on the basis of appropriate representation in all its temporary and permanent institutions, end of quote. In other words, even as the state was being formed and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were being expelled, the state promised those who might be able to remain, and Golda Meir famously said at the time, there should be as few as possible remaining in our state. So even those who do remain, that they would be, that is a minority within a Jewish nation state, promising them equal individual, but definitely not national rights. This promise, of course, was not kept. As Palestinian citizens of Israel were put under military rule until 1966, this was not alluded to in the first panel, during which time most of their lands were confiscated. Arguably, this was why they were under military rule for that period. The following year, another vast concentration of Palestinians came under Israeli occupation and have been deprived of any rights of citizenship ever since. Nor were those expelled from what became the State of Israel ever allowed to return to their homes on the logic articulated by Golda Meir and Ben-Gurion at the time. And yet, I would argue that the 1948 Declaration of Independence can serve as the basis for a constitution that would extend equal rights to all those under Israeli rule. And this brings me to some thoughts about how the Israeli Declaration of Independence compares with the Palestinian Declaration of Independence of 1988. So let me start by saying that the Holocaust and the Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians, were both parallel and irreconcilable events. In the wake of the Holocaust, nothing could sound more just than the demand of the Zionists to have a state of their own. As the Declaration of Independence stated unambiguously, quote, "The Holocaust that has recently occurred to the Jewish people, in which millions of Jews were slaughtered in Europe, proved definitively once more the need for a solution for the Jewish people, deprived of homeland and independence, by renewing a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, which will open the gates of the homeland to every Jew and endow the Jewish people with the status of a nation of equal rights within the family of nations." Nothing could sound more just than that. And yet, in the wake of the Nakba, nothing could sound more just than the demand of the Palestinians to be allowed back to their own land, from which they were brutally expelled. As the Palestinian Declaration of Independence of November 15, 1988, famously drafted by the great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, stated, quote, "The occupation of Palestinian territory and parts of other Arab territory by Israeli forces, the uprooting of the majority of Palestinians and their displacement from their homes by means of organized intimidation, and the subjection of the remainder to occupation, oppression, and the destruction of the distinctive features of their national life are a flagrant violation of the principle of legitimacy and of the Charter of the United Nations and its resolutions recognizing the national rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to return and the right to self-determination, independence and sovereignty over the territory of its homeland," end of quote. The Israeli Declaration of Independence of 1948 states, "Eretz Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, the spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books." So I would say, of course, Zionism is a political movement, but as a political movement, it alludes to that history. Whether it's history or myth is totally another question. The 1988 Palestinian equivalent declares, quote, "On the same terrain as God's apostolic missions to mankind and in the land of Palestine was formed, the Palestinian Arab people was brought forth. There it grew and developed, and there it created its unique human and national mode of existence in an organic, indissoluble, and unbroken relationship among people, land, and history." So it's making basically the same argument. In 1948, the declaration states, "After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom," end of quote. The 1988 declaration asserts, quote, "In the heart of its homeland and on its periphery, in its places of exile, near and far, the Palestinian people has not lost its unwavering faith in its right to return, nor its firm belief in its right to independence." As I see it, these two documents succinctly encapsulate the dilemmas dating back to 1948, even as they also point to a way forward. The State of Israel was founded by Jews displaced from the diaspora, yet its violent birth in 1948 led to the displacement of the vast majority of its native population and the unjust, and since 1967, entirely undemocratic rule over those who remained behind or came under occupation. Ironically, once the displaced had displaced others, they became pawns of the fate they had imposed on themselves, recreating another version of the trap from which they had hoped to liberate themselves. Now that the land was theirs and they were the majority, their previous undisputable right to it increasingly came and comes into question. For what of the people they had evicted? What gave them permission to drive out an entire people and then act as if it had never existed? The Palestinians refused to accept the logic of eviction, refused to assimilate into other Arab nations, all those 21 nations we heard about earlier, refused to forget their homes and their lands, and the Jews who had come back to their land and called it their homeland discovered that here too the land would never be fully theirs, fully and entirely theirs, so long as millions of people, those who had been pushed out and all their progeny, remained refugees from a land that had once been their own. But if we read again these two documents, we can see that both express a fundamental truth and yearning for justice. Can they be reconciled? I believe the first step in such a reconciliation is for each side to recognize the justice of the other and apply the principles they espouse to the other side. The land is patient, but the people are seething, constrained and uncomfortable in their spaces, violent and fearful. They're not at home with themselves and with the other side. Perhaps the only way to put an end to displacement is no longer to push out, but to bring in, not to demarcate, but to dismantle the barriers, to recognize that this land can be a home only when it is finally all of its people's homeland. Thank you.
If we can keep our comments to ourselves and frame the questions,
Could you please be quiet?
we will have plenty of time for conversation. I would encourage you to put your questions into a note card form, please. Sir.
Shame on you.
Sir.
Shame on you.
Okay, we're going to move to the next panelist, please. Please. Deborah Dash-Moore will be shifting our attention away from documents and political discussions and declarations of independence to questions of film and photography. And Deborah, if I can turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you for leaving. Appreciate it. I hope that you're able to hear me. If you can't, please just raise your hand, okay? You cannot hear? Oh, you can. Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm switching the focus. We've been speaking very much about the creation of the state and the implications of that. I want to focus on popular culture that was created by American Jews and the ways it reached Americans, both Jewish and Christian. We heard previously about Ben Hecht with Adina's wonderful presentation. I know that Eric Alterman has a different view of what I'm going to be saying in his new book, so you can get an alternative if you look at it. You see the poster for the movie Exodus, which I think serves as an excellent and influential example of how popular culture by American Jews influenced Americans. I want to start with the immediate post-war era and the arrival of Reuben Daphne to Los Angeles. Handsome, dark-haired, with a thin mustache, sort of like Errol Flynn, a hero who had parachuted behind enemy lines into Hungary. Daphne arrives in an effort to meet Jews in the motion picture industry to convince them that Jews needed a home of their own. They could not return to Europe. American Jews working in the motion picture business found his message irresistible. You heard about Hecht. I want to draw your attention to Dori Shari. He was the head of MGM, and he wore his social conscience on his sleeve. Also to Leon Uris, a former U.S. Marine, successful novelist, brought up in a communist home, a screenwriter who convinced Shari to send him to Israel to research a book in 1956 that would then become a film. And finally, to Otto Preminger, independent producer, refugee from Nazism from Vienna. So, Uris goes to Israel, and when the Sinai campaign broke out, he covered it as a reporter. By the time he returned, Shari had lost his job at MGM, and MGM wasn't interested in the film because of the Arab boycott. But Preminger read Uris's manuscript and optioned the film's rights. The novel appeared in 1958. It stayed on the bestseller charts for a year. Its vision of Israel influenced a generation. How many of you have read or seen the movie? Okay, good. You know what I'm talking about. Great. All right. So you can see one of the key elements of the movie in Saul Bass's poster, namely the linkage of the Holocaust with the flames licking at clenched fists and open hands, one of which holds a gun, symbolizing the transformation of Jews from being devoured, burned, to becoming fighters with weapons who emerge out of the legacy of the Holocaust. Exodus portrayed Jews through American eyes. Uris saw his own image reflected in his vision of the new Jew. What was that vision? We have been fighters. Israelis became surrogate strong men for suburbanites, as Miriam Morrow's forthcoming book will explore. This even reached State Department officials, those guys who Jeff rightly brought our attention to. One of them, for example, admitted that he admired and sympathized with Ari Ben Canaan, the hero of the book and the novel, and the film. Israel, this official admitted, quote, is a nation of farmers and fighters, real people. They are not the Jews here who are so materialistic and money mad, close quote. Right? But Preminger brought his own interpretation to the novel. He fired Uris as a screenwriter. He hired the blacklisted communist Dalton Trumbo. Preminger wanted to show both sides, good Brits and bad Brits, Irgun and Palmach, legitimation of Jewish terrorists, and the struggle of what he characterized as brothers. And we heard some of that in the first panel, this internal conflict, right? It's there on the screen as well. The central theme, however, retains the link with the Holocaust and how Israel rescues survivors. It was shot on location. This is the Jewish homeland. Could we see the clip now?
Valley of Jezreel. You dug straight down, far enough there, you'd find the ruins of Megiddo. You'd find the very same paving stones that Joshua walked on when he conquered it. That's Abu Yesha, It's an Arab village. To the left is Gandafna. Do you know your Bible?
In a Presbyterian sort of way.
That's Mount Tabor.
I remember where Deborah gathered her armies.
That's where she stood when she watched Barak march out to fight the Canaanites. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor and 10,000 men with him. It's in the book of Judges. The Canaanites had 900 iron chariots, but Barak had men 3,200 years ago. That's when the Jews first came to this valley. It wasn't just yesterday or the day before.
Isn't your father's name Barak?
In Russia, he was Yakov Rabinsky. But when he came here, he took the name of Deborah's general. He called himself Barak ben Canaan, Barak the son of Canaan. And this valley became a Jewish land once again. He can give you the date that every clump of trees was planted down there to the month.
Don't get excited. We're not debating now. I'll grant anything you say.
No, I just wanted you to know that I'm a Jew. This is my country.
Okay. All right, so you got the message, right? Okay. Movies are not meant to be subtle, and this one is definitely not. Okay. So Ari Ben Canaan here is in the mode of what we call a moreh derech, right? We've already met him as a laconic soldier, fighter, underground organizer, audacious leader of men. The moreh derech is the interpreter of the land and Tanakh. His history lesson is important. I just wanted you to know that I'm a Jew. This is my country. And Eva Marie Saint identified with the character of Kitty, the American nurse that she plays. Like Kitty, she had held anti-Semitic views, and she gradually changed them. That's what she hoped she could do in the movie for Americans who watched. She wanted to let Kitty allow Americans who didn't like Jews to change their minds as the movie progressed, just as Kitty changed her mind by falling in love with Ari. In case the message of whose land it belonged to wasn't clear, the theme music to the film by Ernest Gold was subsequently given lyrics. The lyrics go in part, "This land is mine. God gave this land to me." Pat Boone, an evangelical Christian, sang it, and it became a popular hit. The movie, ironically, doesn't focus on either the British or the Arabs. It really focuses on the struggle between two brothers, representing Irgun and Haganah. So you get debates between these two versions of Zionism. The movie suggests that both are right, a very American solution. Preminger was pleased that he angered both Cherut and Mapam, revisionists and labor Zionists. So Exodus gave Americans, Jewish and non-Jewish, a hero to root for, the plucky little Jewish state fighting for its freedom became a Hollywood legend. And because non-Jewish Americans momentarily identified with the screen Israel, American Jews went further and blurred the distinction between imagination and reality. They accepted Exodus's version of Zionist history. Now, not everyone, of course. New York Jewish intellectuals rejected it. Commentary magazine, for example, ran a symposium in 1971, and one of the participants said, "Even Israel cannot save us." Now, on to 1967. The version, can we get a, oh, okay, no, next one, okay. The version of Zionism in Exodus lodged in the fantasies of American Jews. Israel, in its cinematic form, became their homeland, and Israelis their alter egos. In the crisis of June of '67, it seemed that Israel followed a Hollywood script. First came 3 weeks of increasingly unendurable tension, until Israel stood completely alone, as a Hollywood hero should stand, against the massed might of the entire Arab world. And then, in 6 brilliant days, Israel single-handedly fought the Arab armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, reunited Jerusalem, recaptured the Sinai, and doubled the territory of the state. Image and reality fused. Israel redeemed its promise. One can see in this cover photo by Life magazine similarities between Paul Newman as Ari Ben Canaan and the soldier. Right? Inside, there's a photo, which I'm not showing you, of Yitzhak Rabin, the magazine there claiming that he was the prototype for Ari Ben Canaan. Life influenced visual imagery of Americans in these decades. It suggests that history and fiction merge, and that a hero of the silver screen commands Israeli armies across the Sinai Desert. Here, the soldier is in the Suez Canal, exultant, smiling, weapon in hand. Ralph Cameron's photo suggests a generic blue-eyed hero, muscular body visible beneath wet clothes. The weapon is a Russian Kalashnikov, a captured trophy of the war. This soldier is Israeli, the new Jew. Why choose this for the cover? Because the first time we see Paul Newman in Exodus, he is emerging from the water, bare-chested, wearing a Star of David, a hero arising from the waters. With Exodus, I would suggest, Israel entered the Jewish American imagination as a romantic screen legend. As Hollywood had done with countless other stars, so it did with Israel. The Dream Factory took the mundane reality of a small, poor state struggling to absorb thousands of destitute immigrants and remade it into a living romance. Pretty powerful stuff.
Thank you, Deborah. Dr. Miran Mora is collecting questions. While we're gathering them, perhaps Jeff, Omer, and Deborah, if you could perhaps direct a question to one of your fellow panelists on anything you might want to comment on before I have a chance to look at the questions.
I just have a question to Jeff. I'm curious where you put the period of the British Mandate into this, which, sorry, I'm asking Jeff how you put the British Mandate into your framework in the sense that arguably without the British Mandate, the framework for a Jewish state would not have been created.
The British threw up their hands in early 1947, said they were unable to find a solution, and so Foreign Minister Bevan was confident, mistakenly, that there would be a huge majority in the United Nations opposing any kind of Jewish state in what had formerly been British Mandate Palestine. And he misread the international, well, I mean, the bolt, the surprise of May 47 was Stalin's decision to support the establishment of a Jewish state. Many people made mistakes. Bevan made mistakes. Stalin made mistakes. Stalin mistakenly thought that the Jewish state would be a Trojan horse for Soviet expansion in the Middle East. So did the British Foreign Office, and so did the State Department. They were all wrong. I hope that, yeah.
I just want to rephrase the question in the sense that what I'm asking is, I mean, I think your point about what happens in 47 is well taken, but one would say that the state in being, that the Yishuv becomes a state in being in the 19 and 20s under the auspices and largely with the assistance of the British Empire, from the Balfour Declaration all the way at least to 1936. So in that sense, that there are two sides to the story, and that is part of the British Empire, right? That Palestine is a British project that it then, as you say, retreats from.
One of the things that I've noticed, I'm a historian of modern German history and modern European history, not of the Middle East, but one of the things I've noticed in the scholarship that is critical of the establishment of the Jewish state is a preoccupation with the 1920s and the 1930s, and not a great deal of attention to the history of, not just the Holocaust, but the history of the Second World War and its aftermath. And here I'm not telling you anything you don't know or haven't even written about. So with the establishment of the White Paper and then British restrictions on Jewish immigration, Britain, the British Foreign Office and Churchill's sentiments were different, but the Foreign Office was driving the policy, was opposed to the establishment of a Zionist project. They were opposed to the Balfour Declaration. They thought it was, Attlee and Bevan thought the Balfour Declaration was a huge mistake. And after the war, after 45, they did what they could to oppose it. And the Foreign Office was so important because the United States had just won the Second World War, and with close cooperation with the British, and the personal connections between the diplomatic and military leadership between the British and the Americans were very important. They were friends. They'd fought a war together. And so what the British thought should happen in the Middle East was very important for the State Department and the Pentagon in Washington. You're right about the 20s and 30s, but my point would be that after 39, and especially after, well, the tragedy is that the Britons saved the Jews of Europe in the Battle of Al Alamein.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a huge tragedy. If it hadn't been for the British and the Australians and the New Zealand forces in 1942, the Roma Corps could have gotten to Palestine, and they would have extended the Holocaust to Palestine. So it's just a huge tragedy that Churchill wasn't able to overwhelm, well, he was out of office then, but for reasons that William Roger Lewis has gone into in more detail, Attlee and Bevan changed their policies very dramatically after they left India. That we've left India, but we're not going to leave the Suez, we're not going to leave, so we're going to make a stand here. And it wasn't just Ben Hecht, but also Ben Gurion and the Haganah. This was a struggle of British imperialism against the anti-colonial Zionists. That's how people saw it at the time. And Nelson Mandela, and years later, even read Begin's The Revolt with great enthusiasm as an important document of post-war anti-colonialism. But I'm going on too long, but I hope that addresses what you...
So how about since I do have a bunch of questions and I'm going to try and synthesize them, but please, Deborah, go first.
One
yes.
question for Omar. The parallels that you showed were really, really impressive between the two declarations. And I'm wondering if the second declaration, if you know, did they deliberately try to structure similar sort of statements, albeit through the Palestinian eyes?
I think yes. Of course. I mean, you can say that the Palestinian national movement itself is a response to Zionism. It's also part of the growth of Arab nationalism in general, but it's very much a specific response to Zionism, and so there is a parallelism going on here. That they say you have rights and we have rights, and each side is arguing to be entirely just, to the exclusion of the other. But yes, I would say that is the case.
Jeff would like to interject.
Yeah, I have a comment and question to Deborah and to Omer. the reality, the military diplomatic reality of the relationship between the United States and Israel from 1948 to 1969 was distance. The United States was not a crucial ally of the State of Israel in these years, not militarily, diplomatically, yes, and emotionally, and the film Exodus, and there's a lot of romance in the American Jewish community, a lot of romance in the American Jewish community about the relationship between the United States and Israel in its first 2 decades. Israel's most important ally was France, not the United States. So that's sort of a comment and a question. Exodus, the film, it made me think that I should try to get Israel's moment done as a film. Maybe more people would pay attention to the but so what contribution did Exodus make to this, what I'm calling a romance? And Omer, on this panel, you and I are not going to resolve the question of the, quote, expulsion of the Palestinians and all that. But my question to you is this, that the Arab states and the Arab Higher Committee made a set of political decisions in 1947. They had the option of establishing a state of their own. And they turned it down. And they went to war instead. And then when they launched the war, they claimed that they were innocent victims who had no responsibility for the subsequent disaster that befell them. They started a war, and they lost a war. Those are partisan comments, which you won't agree with. But my question, this is from one historian to the other, is about the question of agency and Arab agency, and the agency of what were then called the Palestine Arabs. I mean, what they have succeeded in, what Darwish's declaration succeeded in doing, was eliminating that agency. And in politics, of course, everybody wants to present themselves as the innocent victim, and nobody wants to present themselves as responsible for anything. Or maybe sometimes people do. But in this case, that's what troubled me. And you've obviously thought about this for years, and you decided to make the comments you made today. So what do you have to say about this question of Arab and Palestinian agency?
No, you go first.
You sure? Go.
Look, thank you, Jeff, for talking about the romance, but it's a romance, and I'm not quite sure, how does it fit in? It fits in with, I tried to give some of the steps with Uris's experience himself as in military service in the U.S. Marines in the Pacific. He writes a novel about that. Hollywood was fascinated by Israel. I mean, Daphne was just the right guy to reach out. He was just trying to raise funds, but he was selling a message, which, went over very well with these people who are engaged in what is often called the dream factory. Preminger, as an independent producer, didn't have the constraints of the large studios like MGM. So, yeah, it all sort of comes together, and the fact that it doesn't fit with Eisenhower telling, the Brits and the French and the Israelis to withdraw from Sinai makes absolutely no difference. What mattered to Uris was that he was out there, watching the Israeli army and feeling identified with it and seeing, Jews, that's what we are, we're fighters. Now, he knew he was a fighter, but somehow it didn't register. I mean, after all, you're not a Marine in the Pacifics and not trained to fight, for goodness sakes. But that's not what he wanted to present as a Jew. And so here, it's the Jewish army piece. And in that way, it relates really to the Ben Hecht stuff. So what's going on with Eisenhower, the creation of AIPAC, all those other things, that doesn't matter for these purveyors of popular culture. And that's why I gave you, the commentary things. The New York Jewish intellectuals hated the movie. They hated the novel. They thought it was terrible. They liked Philip Roth.
Can we hear Roltov's response to
Yes, I'm sorry. I apologize.
In the interest of time, of course, we're going to go right to Omer. I also perhaps wanted to synthesize about 4 questions from the audience. You won't be surprised to learn there's some questions from the audience. Perhaps to roll all of this into a...
I would just forget what I say.
Let him speak.
Go first, yes.
I'll just be quick. Look, I mean, I would say 2 things. One is, just as in Palestinian historiography and telling of 1948, the war does not exist, and it's only the expulsion. In Israeli telling and myth of 1948, there's a war, but there's no expulsion. So both groups are playing the same game, only the one of them won and the other lost. In that sense, there is a kind of parallel between the two. The second thing I would say is, you know, in World War II, Germany lost the war, and Germany fought, and I spent some time writing on that, an extremely brutal war. It killed millions and millions and millions of people, not only Jews, Soviet citizens, in huge numbers. The Soviet Union occupied much of Germany. There was talk at the time, as you know, let's turn Germany into an agricultural country, let's destroy it entirely. But it wasn't done. And Germany was to blame. There was no question that Germany was to blame. At the end of 1948, and I should say, half of the Palestinians who were expelled from the country, expelled before the attack by the Arab armies, that is during the civil strife between local Palestinians and the Haganah, and then the IDF. Once the war is over, there is no talk at all about them ever coming back. The entire 400 to 500 villages are destroyed, are bulldozed over time. I grew up in the 1950s in Israel. We were still surrounded by villages, by cactus, by sabra fences. We had no language to speak about it. This was not spoken about. Those people had disappeared, and it was gone and forgotten. So, were they to blame for fighting the Jews? Well, you could argue about that because they thought that they were right to fight the Jews. They thought the Jews came and occupied their country. The Jews said, we came back home. But outside of that argument, what the state did in the immediate aftermath of the war, clearly as a policy, was to eliminate any evidence of there ever having been such a population. And so, in that sense, yes, they obviously were also to blame. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that this has disappeared, including, as we heard this morning, you can talk about Zionism and the state without actually making any reference to the Palestinians, as if they're not part of it. And one has to remember that today, half of the population under Israeli control is Palestinian. 50%. Most of them, according to Israeli population statistics published just a few days ago, half of the population under Israeli control is Palestinian. 21% of them are citizens.
Maybe I can add a comment that synthesizes about 4 questions from the audience that further complicates everything. And I'll try and do it in a way that will be both, will do justice to our field as historians. It'll also have some methodological ramifications, perhaps, and it's going to entail zooming out just a little bit more broadly. If we want to write the history of 1948, all right, and if we want to do it in as historically responsible way as possible, how do we historicize the violence of that year that undeniably claimed many hundreds of thousands of Palestinian victims who went into exile, alongside the larger world violence going on in the partition of India and Pakistan, also against the backdrop of the expulsion of 800,000 Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, also against the backdrop of the violence in the 20s and 30s, the 36 to 39 Palestinian rebellion. I have a sense that what a lot of people have difficulty oftentimes coping with is the sense that if the blame is shunted too far on one side and the other side gets a free pass, to put it very crudely, then we're not dealing with justice. So how do we integrate all of these instances of violence, knowing what we do about the 20th century being such a horrible century of violence in any case, and the realization that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, whether it's 12 million Germans being expelled, whether it's 10 million Hindus and Muslims in Pakistan, India, how do we tie all that together, or is it just a fool's errand?
Are you asking me, or?
I'm trying to get us to lunch, in all honesty.
Maybe lunch. I think Jeff has an answer, though.
All right, Jeff's going to bring us home so we can
Jeff
have
has an answer.
We have 90 seconds. I'm randomly saying.
I don't want to stand between you and lunch. I take a slight issue with what Omer said about Israeli historians. Benny Morris is a dear friend, and his works on the origins of the Palestinian refugee issue and his history of 1948 offer, especially the latter, offer, I think, a much needed nuanced view of those events. And I would emphasize that the failure to bring Haj Amin al-Husseini to trial should be understood as one of the early chapters of the Cold War in which Nazi collaborators and Nazi officials were able to avoid reckoning in those early years because of the shift from anti-Nazism and anti-fascism to anti-communism. And Husseini understood how to curry favor in the foreign ministry, especially in France, in order to present himself as a bastion against communism and as somebody who would benefit France's efforts to secure its position in North Africa and the Middle East. We historians we're countercultural. This is the opposite of the film Exodus. We write long books with lots of evidence. In an age of Instagram and Facebook, it's an uphill struggle. But what can I say? I hope that some of you will take the time to read Israel's Moment. And I think that I hope, will learn some things about a period that you think you're very familiar with.
And because
So,
we haven't
wait.
settled any of these issues yet,
Wait,
please
can I just
continue to
say-
discuss over lunch. Yes, Deborah, please.
One last thing, and I'm sorry to hold you from lunch, but in the film, there's a great scene with Ari Ben Canaan and his uncle, and he asks his uncle, he uses the phrase about Jews deserving justice, and his uncle says, Jews and justice don't go together, and he goes through all the just claims of the Arabs there, and then he ends by saying, for once, let's have the injustice fall on someone else instead. That's his rationale for why there should be a Jewish state.
Thank you.